Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Tonight we're going to be reading the first of the three spirits in our reading of A Christmas Carol. But for those of you who missed the Pittston Library's reading the other night, I want to recap the video. But of course, if you feel like you'd rather go back and watch the video, if you didn't get a chance to do that, feel free to pause this premiere. It will be here for you when you're done. But in any case, let's recap. I have some figurines for you today because we like to have fun here. So here's our main character, Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge. And as we all know, he's kind of a crusty fellow, and that's being very kind. Mr. Scrooge is known throughout all of literature as just a mean, nasty kind of fellow. And in our first chapter, we kind of got a sense of Scrooge's character. He is very greedy. He doesn't have time for other people, including any family he has left. He has no friends because he's so nasty to everyone. And just as a general recap, in that first chapter, he was nasty to his employees, Bob Cratchit. He refused to donate to the poor and needy when some donors were coming to his door to seek Christmas cheer. And he was nasty to anybody who came to his door with a Christmas carol. His nephew invited him to dinner, and he just had no time for any of it. But our story goes on to say that it is Christmas Eve and that Scrooge has a chance at redemption and something wondrous is about to happen. So as we're going on, we meet our next character, Scrooge's old business partner, who is 7 years long dead. I don't know if you can see him. He's looking very ghostly under this light. But Jacob Marley. And if you can see from our figurine here, Marley is carrying all the chains and sins of his past life, all the money that he, what's that saying? It's like you can't take it with you. Well, in this case, Jacob took it with him, but all the money that he could have donated and all the time and everything to the poor and the needy, he's dragging with him in his afterlife and living in all this regret. So he's here to warn Ebenezer Scrooge that this too could be his fate, only his chains are going to be much longer and terrible and heavier. And he's hoping to help him avoid all that regret. Scrooge doesn't believe any of this, of course, but that's the way these stories always go. It seems like we have a little bit of work to do before we can get him to try to turn it on. Hopefully. This is Charles Dickens, so we have the redemption arc there. But in any case, let's get on with the story. Chapter 2, the first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12. It was 2:30 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten to the works. 12. He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. "Why, it is impossible," said Scrooge, "that I have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It is impossible that anything that happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon?" The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and he could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of this first exchange, paid to Mr. Scrooge, or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again and thought and thought and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost had bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, His mind flew back again like a strong spring released to its first position and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chimes had gone 3/4 more, when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution of his power. The corridor was so long that more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong. 1/4 past, said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong. 1/2 past, said Scrooge. Ding dong. 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Ding dong. The hour itself, said Scrooge triumphantly, and nothing else. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up upon the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those which his face were addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, startled up from the half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. As close to it as I am to you now, and I am standing at the spirit of your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child, as like an old man viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and drawn to its back, was white as if with age, yet the face had not a wrinkle to it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its holds were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet were delicately formed, were like those upper members bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of freshly green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there was a spring of clear jet of light, which by all of this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered, now in one part and now in another, and what was light in one instant what at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now with a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, which dissolving parts no doubt would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would have been itself again, distinct and clear as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish nature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in its cap, and begged him to be covered. "What!" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so soon put me out, with worldly hands, the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having willfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obligated, but could not help thinking that the night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped its robe in supplication. "I am mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," the spirit said, laying its hand upon its heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished, not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, and it was clear, cold winter day, with snow upon the ground. "Good heavens," said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares, long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it?" said Scrooge with fervor. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them, with boys on their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits, and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travelers went on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see him? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he had heard them give each other Merry Christmas, as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas, what good had it ever done him? "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child neglected by his friends is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by the well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock supplemented cupola on the roof, and a bell hanging upon it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, but for spacious offices were little used, their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowl clucked and strutted in the tables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall and glancing upon the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthy savor in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting in up by candlelight, and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made bare still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, Not a drip from the half-thawed water-spout in the dull yard behind them, not a eye among the leafless boughs of one despondent holper, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with softening influence and gave freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt and leading an ass laden with wood by the bridle. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come, and for the first time just like that. Poor boy. And Valentine," said Scrooge, "and his wild brother Orson, there they go. And what's his name, who was put down in his drawers, asleep at the gate of Damascus? Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down Bajinai. There he is upon his head. Serve him right, I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?" To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects in the most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city indeed. "There's the parrot!" cried Scrooge, green body and yellow tail, with a thing like lettuce growing out of the top of his head. "There he is, poor Robinson Crusoe," he called him, when he came home after sailing round the island. "Poor Robinson Crusoe! Where have you been, Robin Crusoe?" The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for his life to the little creek. "Hello, hoop, hello!" Then, with the rapidity of transition, very foreign to his usual character, he said in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff, "but it's too late now." "What's the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge, "nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying that as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell from the ceiling, and the naked lats were shown and said. But how all of this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything that happened so, that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but was walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost with a mournful shaking of his head, glancing anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms around his neck and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful of glee. "Home for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed, that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said yes, you should, and sent me in the coach to bring you. And you're to be a man." And the child, opening her eyes, said, "And are never to come back here. But first, we're going to be together for Christmas all the long, and have the merriest time in the world." "You are quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Mr. Scrooge's box there." And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with such ferocious condescension, and threw him such a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him, and then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of the shivering best parlor that was ever seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes of the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and on a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meager servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it were the same tap that he had tasted before, he'd rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied upon the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoar frost and snow off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. Always a delicate creature whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost, but she had a large heart. So she had, cried Scrooge. You're right. I'll not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, yes. Although they had but a moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of the city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and for the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again, but it was evening and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it, said Scrooge. Was I apprenticed here? They went in at the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if it had been 2 inches taller he might have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again! Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious white waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, all the way in a comfortably oily, rich, fat, jovial voice. Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! Dick! Scrooge's former self, now grown young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear. Yo-ho, my boy, said Fezziwig, no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig, with a sharp clap of his hands, before a man can say, Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how quick those fellows went to it. They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in their place. 4, 5, 6, bared 'em and pinned 'em in. 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12, panting like a racehorse. Hilly-ho, cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with a wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick, cheer up, Ebenezer. Clear away? There was nothing they would have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed away as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was snug and warm and dry, and bright upon a ballroom, as you would desire to see on a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and turned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig with one very substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after the other, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hand round the back again, and the other way, down up the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again as soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this resulting was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, as though there were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dancers, and there were more forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it, struck up "Dear Sir Roger de Coverley." Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, the good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not so to be trifled with, people who would dance and would have no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any time what would have become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone through the dance, advance and retire, hold hands with your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut deftly, that he appeared to wink with his legs, and come up upon his feet again, without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired, but the 2 prentices, they came and said the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious of it, and was looking upon him while the light upon its head burned very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small," echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the 2 apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig. When he had done so, said, "Why, is it not he spent but the last few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps? Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. "It isn't that, spirit. He had the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Save that his power lies in words and looks and things so slight and insignificant that it's impossible to add and count 'em up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge. "No, I would like to be able to say a word or 2 to my clerk just now. That's all." His former self turned down the lamps, and he gave utterance to the wish. And Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the ghost. "Quick." This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh, rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of a growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, whose eyes were tears, which sparkled in the light and shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "Matters little," she said softly. "To you, very little." Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? He rejoined. A golden one. This is the even-handed dealings of the world, he said. There is nothing on which is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. You fear the world too much, she answered gently. All our other hopes have merged into hopes of being beyond the chance of the sword reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? He retorted. Even if I had grown so much wiser, what then? Am I not changed towards you? She shook her head. Am I? Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until, a good season, we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man. It was a boy, he said impatiently. Your own feeling tells you that you are not what you are, she returned. I am. That which promised happiness when we were one of one heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often, how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you. Have I ever sought released? In words, no, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope at its great end. In everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us, said the girl, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him, tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? No. He seemed to yield the justice of the supposition in spite of himself, but he said with a struggle, You think not. I would gladly think otherwise if I could, she answered. Heaven knows. When I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe you that you would choose a dowerless girl? You, who in your confidence with her weigh everything by gain, or choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your one guiding principle to do so, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and release you, with a full heart and for the love of him you once were. He was about to speak, but with her head bent and turned from him, she resumed, You may, the memory of what is past makes me hope you will have pain in this. A very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it, gladly as an unprofitable dream from which it happened. Well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life that you've chosen. She left him, and they parted. Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me? Shadow more, exclaimed the ghost. No more, cried Scrooge, no more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more. But the relentless ghost pinioned him down with both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count. And unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, they were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting itself like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much, and the latter, soon beginning to mingle in the sports, got pillaged by the young brigades most ruthlessly. What would I not have given to be one of them? Though I never could have been so rude. No, I wouldn't for all the wealth of the world have crushed that braided hair and torn it down, and for the precious little shoe I wouldn't have plucked it off, God bless my soul, to save my life. As to measuring her waist in sport as they did, bold young brood, I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown round for a punishment, and never come straight again, and yet I should have dearly liked, I own, to have touched her lips, to have questioned her. that she might have opened them to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes, and never raised a blush, to have its loose waves of hair an inch for which it would have been a keepsake beyond price. In short, I should have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and yet been man enough to know its value. But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she with laughing face and plundering dress was borne towards the center of the flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onset that was made on the defenseless porter, the scaling him, the chairs for ladders to dive into his pockets to spoil him of the brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hung him round the neck, pommel his back, and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight which the development of every package was received, the terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in an act of putting a doll's frying pan to its mouth, and the more was suspected of having swallowed by a fictitious turkey glued on a wooden platter, the immense relief of finding this was a false alarm. The joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they are all undescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlor, and by one stair at a time up to the top of the house, where they went to bed and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside, and when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and had been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Who was it?" "Guess." "How can I? I don't know," she added in the same breath, laughing as he spoke. "Mr. Scrooge." Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone, quite alone in the world, I do believe. "Spirit," said the ghost, or said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you, these were the shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me," Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with the face in which, in some strange way, there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. "Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer." In the struggle, if that can be called a struggle, in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence above him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action, pressing it down upon its head, the spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood of the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which its hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. And that is chapter 2. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight, and I hope you'll see us again for chapter 3, and we'll be meeting the ghost of Christmas Present. Have a good night, everyone.